Hey, this is Dave DeCamp from antiwar.com. This is anti-war news for Friday, May 29th, 2023. All right, the first story at the top of antiwar.com today. The State Department refuses to say if it is working to free a U.S. citizen who is detained in Ukraine. So I kind of dropped the ball on this story. This is a guy named Gonzalo Lira, and he was arrested by Ukraine's security service, the SBU, earlier in May. And Lira is an American citizen. He also has Chilean citizenship. He has a popular YouTube channel, over 100,000 subscribers. He has a large following on Twitter and Telegram. He's also a writer, and he's contributed to several media outlets, including Business Insider. I know he's written for Zero Hedge. But he was born in California, and so he's American. And I've seen some of his stuff. I'm not very familiar with, the content that he puts out, but I've seen him talk before, and he has an American accent. He sounds very American. And he's been very critical of the Ukrainian government and was arrested by the SBU on charges of justifying the Russian invasion. So they're not even trying to say that he's a spy. They're basically just saying he had an opinion that we didn't like, so we arrested him for it, arresting him for his speech. The SBU said in a press release referring to Lira, quote, after the start of the full-scale invasion, the blogger was one of the first to support the Russian invaders and glorify their war crimes, end quote. So the SBU has also accused Lira of discrediting top military and political leadership in Ukraine. He was charged under sections 2 and 3 of Article 436(2) of Ukraine's criminal code, and that outlaws the distribution of materials that justify Russia's actions going back to 2014. So again, just for having a different opinion, they could use this law, and this law was added after the invasion, as the Zelensky government has kind of cracked down on dissent. And so Liam Cosgrove, who's a reporter for the Epoch Times, he was the one last week that asked Nadler about the F-16s. This is him again, and he asked State Department spokesman Matthew Miller if the administration was aware of Lira's detainment, and he asked how the U.S. feels about Ukraine arresting an American for speech. So this is Miller, the State Department spokesman. He said, quote, so I will say in general that we're aware of the report. We obviously support the exercise of freedom of speech anywhere in the world, and I'll leave it at that, end quote. So then he was asked, is the administration, are you working to secure Lira's release? And Miller refused to comment. He said, I'm going to leave my comments where I just left them. Cosgrove also discussed the issue with Ted Lieu, who's a House representative from California. He's a Democrat. And also Marjorie Taylor Greene, a Republican from Georgia. He caught up with them and asked them about this case, and it seemed like both of them were not aware of it. Lieu said that he was not aware of the case, but that U.S. citizens should have the ability to express their thoughts and views, and that he would look into the arrest. Marjorie Taylor Greene said, quote, America is providing weapons, equipment for the defense of their country, but the Ukrainian government is not going to defend any American's freedom of speech, and that is a real problem, end quote. So his arrest received virtually no attention in Western media. Again, I kind of dropped the ball on it because because there was such little coverage. One of the few outlets to cover it was the Daily Beast, and it was this woman, just horrible, just smeared him and didn't question the charges at all. Just said kind of, oh yeah, he's arrested for being a Russian propagandist, is what they're calling him. And according to that article, they spoke with Ukrainian sources. He's facing 5 to 8 years in prison. He's going to be detained, as the case moves forward. So it doesn't seem like he's getting out anytime soon. I know earlier in the war he was arrested but he was released and he stayed in Kharkiv. I think he might have. He's married to somebody in Ukraine. I'm not really sure exactly why he's there. Maybe some of you know more about him than I do. But I think this is just something, again, it just hasn't gotten enough attention. And you just see how hypocritical the U.S. is. Gershkovich, the Wall Street Journal reporter that was arrested in Russia on spying, over spying allegations, immediately right away they called for his release and put out all these statements, and they're always talking about it. But this guy, because he has a different view, they just want to ignore this and sweep it under the rug. So hopefully more people start asking about this. I think, hopefully this story gets around, and more people start asking questions about this case. We're being sold that this is a war for freedom and democracy, yet Ukraine is detaining an American for his speech, for his point of view, his political views. So just doesn't seem right. All right, the next one here. General Milley says that Ukraine should not use U.S. equipment to attack Russia. So this is from Connor Freeman. So Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he reaffirmed that Kiev has long been asked not to use military equipment provided by Washington to conduct attacks against Russian territory. This policy is necessary because such attacks could provoke a direct clash between NATO and Russia, Milley said. So that's what Milley's thoughts are, apparently. And he said this on Thursday. So Milley's comments came after a neo-Nazi group, which operates as part of Kiev's armed forces and cooperates with Ukrainian military intelligence, carried out a cross-border raid in Russia, and they used American armored vehicles. So Milley basically just reaffirming, yes, we have asked them not to use American equipment inside Russian territory. And, it looks like they haven't confirmed it yet. I think the U.S.'s line, what they're saying still, is that they haven't confirmed these reports. It's a holiday weekend right now, so they might just be hoping that people, stop asking about it. Because I think it's pretty obvious. You had on both sides, Russia said they used American weapons, and the people who supposedly did it, these Russian Volunteer Corps and that other group, said that they used NATO weapons. So it seems pretty confirmed to me, but all the U.S. officials are trying to kind of act like it's not. But that's Milley's view. And again, he says because that this could provoke a direct clash between NATO and Russia. That's why they're telling the Ukrainians not to do it. It just goes to show what the risk is when you even have Milley saying that. All right, the next one here. Zelensky asks Ukrainian parliament to sanction Iran for 50 years. So Zelensky has asked Ukraine's parliament to approve a bill that would put sanctions on Iran for 50 years over its alleged military support for Russia. According to the Kiev Independent, the bill would completely ban trade with Iran, block Iranian investments, prevent the withdrawal of Iranian assets from Ukraine, and prohibit technology transfers to the Islamic Republic. And this bill came as Ukrainian authorities said Sunday that Russia launched its largest ever drone attack on Ukraine using 54 Iranian-made drones. And for their part, Iran initially denied selling drones to Russia when Russia first started using these drones. And then they later said that they did give Russia drones, but it was before they invaded. So that's kind of their line on this. But either way, the two countries have been increasing economic and military ties naturally as they both face similar pressure from the West, similar to how Russia and China keep increasing trade. Russia and Iran do as well. And last week, Zelensky said that Iran was sliding into the dark side of history for supplying Moscow with drones, and that prompted a sharp response from Tehran. So Iran's foreign ministry spokesman called Zelensky's comments, quote, a worthless political show staged to provoke the U.S. and certain European states to supply Kiev with more military equipment and financial aid. Iran has always expressed its opposition to the war in Ukraine and its continuation and feels sympathy for the pains and miseries of the Ukrainian people, end quote. And he also said that Zelensky's comments were delusional claims. So they're having a little back and forth. But so, I mean, who knows how much this would really have an impact on Iran, which is already under such crippling sanctions from the U.S. and Europe. But, Zelensky I'm sure that this bill will get approved by Ukraine's parliament if it's something that Zelensky put forward. All right. So the next one here, Russia summons a U.S. diplomat for Crimea comment. So Russia's foreign ministry on Friday summoned U.S. diplomats from the U.S. embassy in Moscow to protest recent comments made by National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan about the U.S. supporting Ukrainian strikes on Crimea. So Russia has controlled Crimea since 2014, but Ukraine and its Western backers do not recognize the peninsula as Russian territory. That means that the Biden administration's ban on Ukraine using weapons inside Russia does not apply to Crimea. So what Milley said doesn't apply to Crimea. But from Moscow's perspective, U.S. supported attacks on Crimea are just as provocative as attacks elsewhere in Russia. And, again, it risks provoking a direct war just as much as attacks on other parts of Russian territory. So the Russian Foreign Ministry said after they announced this, they said, quote, "It is time for Washington to learn that any form of aggression against Russia will continue to be met with the strongest possible response," end quote. And they said that Sullivan was effectively endorsing strikes on Crimea. So Sullivan's position is not really new. The Biden administration has maintained throughout the war that Ukraine can use U.S. weapons on Crimea. Back in July 2022, I asked the State Department if the ban on Ukraine using the HIMARS rocket systems to target Russian territory applies to Crimea, and they told me Crimea is Ukraine. So again, we've seen Victoria Nuland say that the U.S. supports attacks on Crimea, even though Blinken has acknowledged Crimea is a red line. But it is very dangerous, and I think this says something that Russia is, making it known again that, attacks on Crimea, we're going to respond. There's going to be a big response. So hopefully this gets through to the administration somewhat. I don't know. I mean, things are just really escalating and spiraling, and it just doesn't seem like there's any chance for this thing to cool down here. Like there's not any will within the Biden administration to back down. They're just going to keep going. And, it's going to be a while until the F-16s make it to Ukraine. But right now, I believe the Ukrainians could use those British Storm Shadow missiles to target Crimea. So that's something that we might see happen soon. All right. The next one here, Russia condemns Senator Graham's comments on dead Russians. So Russian officials have condemned Senator Lindsey Graham for calling the U.S. funding of Ukraine the best money we've ever spent, after noting that Russians are dying in the conflict. So Graham made it over to Kiev. He was there on Friday, and he met with Zelensky, and Zelensky's office released this video of Graham and Zelensky talking back and forth. And at one point, Graham says, "Oh, Ukraine will be free." He said, "Russians are dying." And then the video, it appeared to cut to a different angle. And he said, "This is the best money we ever spent," with a big smile on his face. So it's not really clear if he said anything between Russians are dying and this is the best money that we spent. But either way, it's very provocative. And Graham has said, insanely provocative things throughout the war. He said that, the Ukrainians are willing to fight to the last Ukrainian. He's called for the assassination of Putin. He said that the U.S. should start shooting down Russian planes after that drone was down in the Black Sea. So, that's just his MO. So I'll play a little bit of this video. This is the one, Andriy Yermak. He's the head of Ukraine's presidential office. So they put out this video. I'm just going to skip ahead to the part where he,
big support. Yes, it's very important.
Free or die. Free or die.
Now we are free,
Yes.
and we will be.
And the Russians are dying. It's the best money we've ever spent. Thank you.
So I'm not sure if you could really hear that. They put this piano music in the video. But basically, again, he says, Russians are dying. He nodded his head, and he has a big smile on his face when they cut to his face, and he says, best money we ever spent. But either way, I mean, saying that, funding this war is the best money we ever spent, it's just ridiculous. And responding to Graham's comments, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, quote, "It is difficult to imagine a greater shame for a country than having such senators," end quote. Dmitry Medvedev, he's the deputy head of Russia's Security Council and a former president. He called Graham an old fool. And then Graham was asked by Reuters to reply to Medvedev's comments. He said, quote, Mr. Medvedev, if you want Russians to stop dying in Ukraine, withdraw. Stop the invasion. Stop the war crimes. The truth is that you and Putin could care less about Russian soldiers, end quote. And then later on Sunday, Graham appeared on Fox News and he called for the U.S. to send Ukraine whatever it wants, give them everything that they're asking for, including the longer range weapons and cluster munitions, which are widely banned by, there's a treaty over 100 countries have signed on to banning them. They drop, hundreds of little bomblets, little tiny bombs that are a hazard for civilians, later on and can kill people that come across them or injure them. Just a very bad situation. And the U.S., a lot, it's there's been growing calls from members of Congress to send Ukraine the cluster munitions. All right. So the next one here, Taiwan says that it is in talks on the U.S. nuclear umbrella. So Taiwan's foreign minister said last week that the U.S. and Taiwan are in talks on the possibility of the island being brought under Washington's nuclear umbrella, a step that would make a catastrophic war between the U.S. and China much more likely. So this is Taiwanese Foreign Minister Joseph Wu. He made the comments before Taiwan's parliament, the legislative yuan. Wu declined to detail the talks when pressed if Taiwan had asked the U.S. to bring the island under its nuclear umbrella. So he says there's just an idea that they're discussing. He said, quote, regarding the discussion of this issue with the United States, it is not suitable for me to make it public here, end quote. So many of the U.S.'s allies are considered to be under the protection of the U.S. nuclear umbrella, including, in Asia, South Korea, Japan, and then every member of NATO. So dozens and dozens of countries. But giving such a guarantee to Taiwan would mean that the U.S. could use nuclear weapons if China invades the island, or if a war breaks out by other means, if it emboldens the Taiwanese. So such a guarantee is unlikely to happen in the near term, as it would require a very radical change in U.S. policy. So we've had President Biden say that he would send troops to intervene if China attacks Taiwan. He said that multiple times now. But the official U.S. policy still hasn't changed, and it's still ambiguous. They don't have a mutual defense treaty with Taiwan anymore. So this would require a very drastic change. But even just the idea that this is being discussed between the U.S. and Taiwan, of course, that's a big provocation toward China. When it comes to nuclear weapons, China has a no first use policy for its nuclear arsenal, but the U.S. policy leaves open the option to use nukes in response to a conventional attack. So just what we need, the U.S., extending the areas that it's willing to go to nuclear war over. And, when it comes to China's planning, I mean, if China seriously thinks that this might happen eventually, that the U.S. could forge strong enough military ties with Taiwan to give them some sort of nuclear protection, I mean, I think that would motivate China to take action, earlier than they planned, thinking that, to avoid that. So I just think this is, again, just the fact that this is being discussed. And, it seems like that's all it is. There's no sign that this is something that can happen soon, but still, it's just very, very concerning. And I'm going to kind of follow up on this because this was just really in Taiwanese media, and I saw it on the South China Morning Post. But I want to see, maybe ask the State Department if they can confirm it, or just see what they say when I ask them about it. Because it's a pretty serious issue here. And we know that there's all sorts of ways these hawks in Congress want to increase support for Taiwan. So it's not out of the question that that's something that the U.S. would actually consider. All right. So the next one here, U.S. airstrike in Somalia targets Al-Shabaab after an attack on an African Union base. So the U.S. is back to launching airstrikes in Somalia. U.S. Africa Command said in a press release that it launched an airstrike against Al-Shabaab after they attacked a Ugandan base in Somalia, and the Ugandan troops are there as part of the African Union's mission in Somalia, known as ATMIS. So the Al-Shabaab attack was launched on Friday, and it targeted an army base in a town about 75 miles southwest of Mogadishu. The assault started with suicide car bombings, followed by an intense firefight. Al-Shabaab claimed that they killed 137 soldiers in the attack. That number is not confirmed. That's a pretty high number. Uganda's president has acknowledged that there were casualties, but he did not say how many were killed or wounded. AFRICOM said that it launched the airstrike on May 26th near the base in support of ATMIS. It said that the strike destroyed weapons and equipment that were taken by Al-Shabaab. So they blew up, which is probably American weapons, I would guess, that they gave to Uganda or the African Union fighting in Somalia. So Al-Shabaab comes in, launches this attack. They take a bunch of equipment, and the U.S. blows it up. And the strike was the second reported by AFRICOM in Somalia in the month of May. The command said that it launched an airstrike on May 20th in Jilib, which is a city about 240 miles southwest of Mogadishu, so pretty far south in Somalia. AFRICOM said that the May 20th strike wounded one Al-Shabaab member and claimed no civilians were harmed. However, the Pentagon is notorious for undercounting or lying about civilian casualties, especially in Somalia, where U.S. operations are shrouded in secrecy. So the May 20th bombing, that airstrike, was the first airstrike that AFRICOM reported in Somalia since February 21st. So there's kind of a long lull in U.S. airstrikes, at least in airstrikes that AFRICOM is reporting. We don't know if they report everyone. And there's also the CIA can launch drone strikes in Somalia, and they don't have to tell anybody about that. But for the most part, it seems like there has been a lull in U.S. airstrikes in Somalia. After they escalated, if you remember, toward the end of 2022, and then in early 2023 in January and the first half of February, there was a good amount of U.S. airstrikes in Somalia, but it seems like it winded down. So who knows if this means that there's an escalation, big escalation happening here, or, because we know it seems like there's some fighting on the ground. Al-Shabaab might go on the offensive more, and then the U.S. is going to be launching airstrikes to back the government there. So, and recently Congress voted down that resolution that was introduced by Matt Gaetz to leave Somalia, pretty similar to the one that was introduced in Syria. The vote was, about 100 members of Congress voted to leave Somalia, with about an even split between Democrats and Republicans, but still not nearly enough to get out. But hopefully there's some more progress, more people, become against the U.S. presence in Somalia, and maybe we'll see more legislation on that. All right, the next one here. This is from Connor Freeman over at the Libertarian Institute. The South Yemen intensifies push for secession. So the UAE-backed National Assembly of the Southern Transitional Council, the STC, called on its forces to secure a military takeover and annexation of the entirety of Yemen's southern territory during a meeting on Monday. This was last Monday. And the STC is intensifying its push for secession, seeking a partition corresponding with the borders of the former states of North Yemen and South Yemen, which existed prior to the country's 1990 unification. So this shows that, the U.S. and Saudi-backed government in Yemen, it doesn't have any real power in the country. They control some territory, but this STC is going to try to, they control a lot of South Yemen already, the STC, and it looks like they're going to try to take more territory from the U.S. and Saudi-backed government. And then the Houthis control most of what was North Yemen, again, before the countries were reunified in 1990. So that doesn't leave this U.S.-backed government with much. And the U.S. is kind of position on the peace talks between the Saudis and the Houthis has been, it's good, but they really need a deal between the Houthis and the government and the exiled Yemeni government. But realistically, that's just not going to happen. They don't have much leverage over the Houthis. So the deal is going to have to be between the Houthis and the Saudis. And who knows what's going to happen with the STC in South Yemen. But again, it just goes to show that this government that's in exile, that's operating out of Riyadh, that the U.S. wants to be involved in some sort of deal, barely controls the country. That's just the reality on the ground there. All right. So the next one here, The US and the EU scold Kosovo for escalating tensions with Serbia. So this is interesting. The US really is not happy with Kosovo after they violently dispersed some Serb protesters in the north. So Europe's largest economies in the US slammed Kosovo for exacerbating tensions with Serbia after Pristina used force to secure access to municipal buildings in the north of the Balkan country near the Serbian border. Police used tear gas in the town of Zvekin to disband a crowd of ethnic Serbs on Friday who were trying to block a newly elected Albanian mayor from entering his office building. The violence triggered an immediate backlash from Serbia, whose president, Alexander Vučić, placed his army on full combat alert and told military units to move closer to the border with Kosovo. He's also facing a lot of protests against his government right now, as this is going on as well. Washington was quick to condemn Pristina for using violence and worsening relations with Serbia. Tensions between the two countries have been persistent since, the NATO carved Kosovo out of Serbia, out of Yugoslavia, and, during that bombing campaign in the 1990s. And then Kosovo formally declared independence in 2008, but a lot of countries don't recognize Kosovo. But Blinken, of all people, put out a statement that said that really condemned Kosovo's actions, tear gassing the Serbs. He said, quote, "The United States strongly condemns the actions by the government of Kosovo to access municipal buildings in the north of Kosovo by force, actions it took against the advice of the United States and Kosovo's European partners. These actions have sharply and unnecessarily escalated tensions, undermining our efforts to help normalize relations between Kosovo and Serbia, and will have consequences for our bilateral relations with Kosovo." End quote. So that's pretty significant. I mean, I've never really seen them go after Kosovo because they've been violent, have not treated the ethnic Serbs in northern Kosovo well for a very long time. And I've never really seen the U.S. go after them like this, So it's very interesting. And I know that the U.S. and the EU have been trying to broker this normalization deal. I think that's a lot of the people inside Serbia that are angry with the president, with Vučić, is because of that, because they think he's going to be willing to give up too much to sign some sort of normalization deal with Kosovo. But anyway, it's interesting. We'll see how it plays out. All right, the last one here is just, I'm sure everybody has heard, but Erdogan, the Turkish president, claimed victory in the presidential runoff. He ended up coming out ahead, pretty clearly. He beat the closest challenger 52% to 48%. So by 4% there, he won, and Erdogan is not going anywhere. And so Turkey's foreign policy, relationship with NATO, relationship with Russia, doesn't seem like it's going to be changing anytime soon. That's it for the news. Go check out our viewpoints. We have run from Ted Snyder, drones over the Kremlin. Is Ukraine trying to assassinate Putin? One from Jonathan Grotfent, Memorial Day, honoring the fallen by ending wars. One from Doug Bandow, no security guarantee for the Saudis. One from Patrick Eddington, time to end the FBI's FISA follies. One from James Bovard, expose the biggest FBI spy scandal of the year. That's everything for me for today. I hope everybody, if you're off on Memorial Day, have a good holiday, have a good day off. You could always support antiwar.com if you go to antiwar.com/donate and share this show, share antiwar.com, tell your friends about it. Follow us on Twitter. Me at @DeCampDave is my Twitter account. But that's it. I'll be back tomorrow with some more news for you. Thanks for listening.